What's the nastiest thing you've seen come out of a human body? Took care of a guy that had a disorder where all of the sweat, skin cells and oily TC that the skin normally exudes got trapped. He has stopped taking care of himself for years and then got an infection. So by the time he got to us, every single pore was packed full of rotten pus that smelled worse than you can even imagine. And every time he moved even a little, even with breathing, the pus would squeeze out. To top it off, he was 400 plus pounds, which just realistically makes it hard to move him to clean well when he could not help at all. Then he would get all slippery with the pus. The odor in that room every time he moved. I had a badly clogged hair follicle on my chest under my nipple. Started a tiny pimple, and I popped it like any other day. 48 hours later, it was growing and painful. My friend was a dermatologist and I went to visit him in his home. He prepped me in his kitchen and opened it with a scalpel. So much pus came out and was smelly and nasty. Instant relief though. A week after leaving the hospital from having my son via C-section, I was in horrific, screaming pain. Ended up in the ER, where it was discovered that I had a softball-sized abscess directly behind the C-section cut. They needed to open me back up and get me cleaned out, but didn't want all that nasty sh to just spill out of me. So they put a tube in me and attached it to a bag to drain it. So I spent a day in a hospital bed with this clear bag filled with putrid, brown, rotting gunk attached to me. It smelled so bad and looked even worse. Why did the bag have to be clear? It's been 15 years, and thinking about it makes me gag. I had a drain similar to yours after my appendix surgery site got infected, but I had mine on for several days. I honestly don't know why they had to make it clear. The gunk was so damn nasty, but that wasn't the worst part. That was the fact that, since it was attached to me, I could feel how warm the gunk was, and it made me feel so damn sick whenever I felt it. I was congested really bad one morning. I kept coughing to try to hack it out as one does, and right as I was getting out of my car at work, I sneezed something fierce, and a mass of bloody mucus and what I hope were budgers shot out of my nose. It was so large that my face felt empty, like I had lost part of my body. I wasn't even disgusted, just intrigued and shocked, and relieved, but also stressed. I thought I was missing some brain matter. Had a patient with a tumor in his colon due to cancer. The tumor, which was reasonably large, had gotten an infection and developed an abscess which resulted in the infected tumor penetrating the colon wall. The surgeons and doctors were discussing what the best course of action was, and while he waited, the patient came to our floor. He was in too much pain to walk, and so when he told us he felt like he had a bowel movement, we prepared to help clean him up in the bed. Pretty standard stuff for oncology nursing. Except instead of normal poop, or even the standard bloody fesses we sometimes see, this patient had excreted a foul tube of semi-solid stool with streaks of blood and tumor pus in it. It looked like that striped toothpaste, except it was the kind of toothpaste you'd find in Hell or Nurgle's domain instead of the grocery store. The smell was one of the worst things I've ever experienced. If I hadn't had an empty stomach from not eating for hours, I definitely would have thrown up. Even the tech I was with, who had nearly a decade of experience, had to leave the room with me and take a breather before deciding what to do. Patient ended up being just fine. Surgery was successful, and he had no more demon shiz. I'm a dermatological surgical technician for skin cancer removal. AKMOS. After removing a cancer from an older gentleman's leg, we stitched him up and applied steri strips, which fall off by themselves within a week, so no wound care would be needed. The pressure dressing on top of the steris would simply have to be removed in a day or two. This older gentleman came back to the office 1 month after his surgery complaining of an odor coming from his post-surgery wound. When he arrived, the odor was far worse than expected. Employees of the office were gagging. Also, keep in mind, in dermatology we deal with smelly things such as cysts on the regular. Odor typically doesn't bother us. Upon further examination, we realized this patient never took off our original dressing. Once the doctor came in and removed the dressing, we saw anywhere from 60 to 100 maggots burrowed in this man's open wound, all of which had to be manually extracted. Just another maggot Monday. When I was in college, I interned with a dentist, and he would do a free dental day where transients and stuff could come in and get dental work done. One guy came in complaining of jaw pain. Turns out that he had a baby tooth that never came out that got engulfed by an adult tooth that then pressed the baby tooth into his jaw. The tooth rotted and festered underneath the permanent tooth. The dentist extracted the permanent tooth, and when he did it shot out a brown fluid that smelled exactly like death, followed by the baby tooth pieces. I pride myself on being pretty calm, but when this happened I had to leave the room and vomit. It pretty much turned me off to wanting to be a dentist. I worked at a funeral home for a bit. The second body I went to pick up had been alone after his death for 2, maybe 3 weeks in the summer. The cops asked us to roll him over so they could see if there were any markings on his back that might indicate that his death wasn't natural. He leaked. It was thick, dark, and had a texture like egg whites. It also smelled like grape Powerade. This happened to my mom, but it still was very disgusting to hear about. So when COVID was first rampant, an old lady came into the clinic saying there's a lot of discomfort in her downstairs, so my heavily pregnant nurse mom and her coworker went to examine her. Turns out this lady has been keeping this super old tampon in her for months and never took it out. My mom said it smelled so bad she could smell it through her mask, and she almost threw up in front of the woman, and her nose was super sensitive when she was pregnant, so it made it even worse. She said she had to swap out with another nurse. They had to shut down that room for the rest of the day to vent out the smell. That is weird. Like, how do you not know you have that in you, or even check and not mention that to anyone first? I went to school with a girl. While we were at a party with other people from our school, she hooked up with a random guy. Things get frisky and a similar thing happened. He screamed in terror thinking he pulled out an organ. We rushed to the room and the smell hit us. He had thrown it on the floor as far away from him as possible and closed to the door. She didn't know you're meant to remove tampons. Extremely dangerous to not know you need to remove them. I once have a viral stomach infection, felt like death for 1 week. Second week I had an unimaginable urge to vomit, which took me by surprise as all I had ingested was a tiny amount of water. By this point I had been vomiting regularly, so knew the feeling. This was different. I dragged myself to the bathroom and vomited in the bidet, and what looked like a snot covered bird's nest came out. Guessing it was my stomach lining. Then I had the best ever feeling of satisfaction. My whole body felt better, and stomach for the first time in a week and a half felt normal again. The nest then dissolved and I washed it down the drain. It was both disgusting and satisfyingly a great feeling. In her late teens, my sister was getting some pretty hardcore boils on the back of her legs that would rupture randomly. Being the loving sister that I am, I decided to check in on her while she at the peak of a boil episode. She was in her room in just her underwear, kneeling at the side of her bed, when I stuck my head in the door. Before I could even speak a word, a massive boil ruptured and shot a waterfall of pus down her leg that resembled cottage cheese. I immediately got pretty woozy and dropped to the floor, trying desperately not to puke. I never asked if she was okay, but at least gave her a pretty good laugh with my display of extreme disgust. I'm a trauma IQ nurse. Something to remember about trauma is that people end up in my IQ after they were just going about their day, then wham, in the hospital they go. Had a 300-ish pound lady whose hygiene wasn't the greatest at baseline get in a terrible car accident after doing some blow and washing it down with some booze. She was in my ICU a few days, sedated and on the ventilator while we were putting her back together, and she just kept getting sicker. Couldn't quite figure out why, so kinda to throw in the kitchen sink they called the gynecologist in to do a pelvic. During said exam out plops a homemade tampon coated in all the nasty green, brown, yellow goo you couldn't imagine, with a pile the size of my fist. I'm a good sized dude. Right behind it, follow this release of Satan's personal brew, came a smell so foul it permeated the entire unit to the point we needed HEPA filters to clear it. In my 15 years of being an ICU nurse I have seen the grossest sh imaginable, but this takes the proverbial cake. Doctor here. I'm an anesthesiologist, so I've seen my share of crazy foreign bodies and rectums, trauma, etc. The one that was disgusting but made me laugh was when a street person got a severe foot infection that developed maggots. That part's not funny, although maggots are real brothers here and were keeping things cleaned up. The funny part was the vascular surgeon who screamed a little every time a maggot dropped on the floor when we were prepping the wound for surgery. She's a really good surgeon, but the wiggly things totally derailed her brain. FWIW, the case went great and the wound improved a lot. Wu-Tang and Rage Against the Machine were coming to town, and some friends, and I had our tickets. We were stoked. A few days before the show, a friend of a friend who was gonna go with gets this giant boil on his neck. He had it cut out the day before and was with us when we walked in the gate. His neck bandaged up. The show starts, and Boil Dude gets all amped up and says he's gonna go get in the pit. A few minutes later, I see him lift it up over everybody, crowd surfing. I noticed that the bandaging on his neck was starting to come loose. That bandage finally popped off, and this spray of bloody pus shot out. He was in motion, so it shot around in all directions, and there was this 3-foot strand of bandaging that they had stuffed inside the wound, trailing him like a long nasty comet tail. The look of horror on people's faces as they realized what it was hitting them, I'll never forget.